So in the last lecture, we talked about how we go about distilling arguments and breaking them down into their premises and conclusions. What we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to talk about some basic vocabulary we use when we discuss evaluating arguments and talk about some of the various criteria we use to judge whether or not an argument is a good argument or a bad argument. And when we talk about evaluating arguments, basically what we're referring to is the activity of determining whether a particular line of reasoning or an argument is plausible or supports the conclusion. So we're going to be looking at things like, well, are the premises good premises? Do the premises actually support the conclusion they claim that they support? Is the conclusion overall acceptable or unacceptable? And before we get started talking about some general criteria and general features that we use to evaluate arguments, I want to begin with kind of a concern that I oftentimes hear people raise when we discuss this. And what some people want to say is they want to say, look, this idea of evaluating arguments, why do we need to talk about this? I mean, basically, whether or not an argument is good is entirely up to each individual. It's all opinion, right? There's really no way we can judge, what you might say objectively and rationally, we can judge whether or not a particular argument is better than another one. Who's to say who's right and who's wrong? Isn't all of this just relative anyway? What you think is what's right for you, and what I think is what's right for me. And it represents a kind of general criticism that sometimes people make about this whole enterprise of evaluating arguments. And what I want to suggest is that I think it's really deeply misheaded and misguided. And what I want to say about this is that at the end of the day, nobody really accepts this at all. Nobody really accepts that whether or not an argument is good or bad is entirely relative. There are some overarching, what you might say, objective or rational standards that everybody uses, and everybody judges the cogency or the plausibility of arguments by. And to illustrate this, I want to give you an example of an argument. And here it is. Here's an argument. Obama wears mom jeans, therefore he is a bad president. Now, I want you to stop and ask yourself, seriously, is this a good argument? What if you met someone who said, man, I was thinking Obama was a great president. You know, he passed the Affordable Health Care Act, he brought about an end, or he helped stave off the financial collapse of '08, but man, have you seen his jeans? This guy is terrible. Suppose somebody made this argument. Would you think, okay, yeah, that's a valid point you're making there. That's a really good argument. I hadn't considered it. Chances are you wouldn't. Chances are, if somebody made this argument, you'd say, you're an idiot. You're foolish. This is a stupid argument. And I think this is a clear instance of a kind of reason or a kind of argument that's bad, and it should be bad to any reasonable, intelligent person. Now, maybe there is somebody out there who finds this argument overwhelmingly persuasive. To that person, I don't really know if there's too much we can say to them, but I would think that most intelligent adults would not find this argument convincing. And why? Well, I think that's obvious too. And the obvious answer is that what kind of jeans that the president wears has no bearing on whether or not he or she is good at their job. It's just completely irrelevant. The premise here is not relevant to the conclusion. And this represents a very, very important point about arguments. It shows that there is at least one standard we already agree to, which is just that premises should be relevant to the conclusions. Now, let me show you another argument. And here's the argument. Terrorist networks have increased during Obama's administration, therefore he is a bad president. Now, truthfully, this is not a very strong argument. It's not a very good argument, because when we look at it, we might say, well, look, there are other reasons to explain the rise of terrorism than anything Obama has done. Or you might say, even if this is true, the first premise, that overall judging whether or not someone is a good president or a bad president depends on more than just one particular aspect. But here's the reason I'm mentioning this argument is because what we can do is we can look at this and we can say that the second argument right here, that this is better than the first argument. And so you should see that just based on these two simple examples, we've already set in place some criteria that we instinctively and intuitively appeal to when we judge whether or not someone's argument is good. On the one hand, we can say that some arguments are clearly bad, and they're bad to any reasonable person. Furthermore, we can weigh arguments against one another. We can say this argument is better than this argument. And these two evaluative judgments, the judgment that this is bad and the judgment that argument 2 is better than argument 1, these aren't entirely relative. These are objective criteria we use to judge the plausibility of arguments. And we can say a lot more about this. In fact, you can take an entire class where you just look at and you evaluate and learn rules for evaluating arguments. But here are some things I want to say up front, is that we recognize that some reasons or some arguments are bad and should be bad to any reasonable person. And here are some examples of some arguments or some reasons that would be objectively bad. First, arguments or reasons that are completely irrelevant to the conclusion. Just like the previous example I gave. Obama wears mom jeans. It's completely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the conclusion. Here's another kind of premise or reason that would be false. Bad. Those that are false. If someone, for instance, they begin an argument and they say, well, premise 1, as we all know, Abraham Lincoln was the first president of the United States. All right, well, that's a terrible way to begin because that's just clearly false. You don't begin arguments with premises that are false. And both of these, and hopefully this seems obvious to you, and hopefully this doesn't seem too far-fetched, because what it shows is that we do have some kind of rational standards that we can use. And whether or not a reason is good or bad is not something that's entirely relative. Here again, look down here, reasons that are confused. And what I mean by that is sometimes people use conceptually confused reasons. So some of you may be familiar with various conspiracy theories, but one of the more popular ones is that America never actually went to the moon, that this was all staged, it was an elaborate hoax. And there are various reasons people believe this. I'll just tell you my opinion is that everything I've ever seen on it has been debunked, and it seems that all evidence points to the fact that we did in fact go to the moon. But some of these reasons that people offer are better than others. I had a friend in high school and his grandfather was convinced that we never traveled to the moon. And here's the reason why. He said, well, look, you can just look at the moon and see that it's too small for anyone to walk on. And that's just really confused, because clearly the moon is going to be smaller when it's at such a huge distance. I mean, that's just a conceptually confused thing to say. Again, another kind of objectively bad reason are going to be reasons that are just implausible or just unsupported. And I'm mentioning all of this just in part to try to argue against that criticism that I brought up a second ago, that whether or not a reason is good or bad is entirely relative, because that's not true at all. Some reasons are clearly bad. Alternatively, we can say that there are some reasons that are good, and they would be good to any reasonable person. So kinds of reasons that are objectively good reasons and would be reasonable to any person are going to be reasons that are what we call self-evident. Something is self-evident basically means that it's once you understand what's being said, the truth of it is obvious and undeniable. So I'm going to give you an example, or I'm going to give you a couple of examples of self-evident truths. So here's one. A is identical to A. Or another way of putting it, 1 is equal to 1. Now imagine someone denied that. They're like, no, I'm not so sure. Maybe 1 equals 2. I mean, what could you possibly say to convince that person? What is more obvious than that 1 is equal to 1? There's nothing that's as basic as it gets. That's the kind of thing that we say is self-evidently true. You don't need an argument to show you that that's true. It's just once you understand what's being said, it's obvious and clear. Another example of something that's self-evident is this: if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. You may remember this from math class. It's called the transitivity of identity. And basically, this is the kind of thing is once you understand what's being said, it should be obvious. I remember when I first learned this, I was in middle school maybe. At first I was thinking, well, I'm not so sure about that. And then I walked through the steps and went, well, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, yeah, then A has to be equal to C. Something is self-evident doesn't mean that you get it the first time you hear it. Maybe you have to think about it for a second, but rather something is self-evident, meaning that once you understand it, the truth of it is obvious to you. Another type of reason that is an objectively good reason is one that is just well established. If something is well established that we all agree to, then that is the kind of thing that is a good reason. So for instance, and this is going to be a little controversial maybe for some of you, but the earth is warming, and 95% of scientists agree that the reason the earth is warming is due to man-made human activity. So this is something that is a well-established reason. The overwhelming support of scientific community is behind this. And so if you had this as a premise in your argument, that would be, in almost all cases, a very good and objectively good reason to have. Why is that? Because it's a well-established claim. Now, I will just say this. There are maybe some contexts in which you might have to use different premises depending on who you are talking to, but I would say in the vast majority of cases, that would be considered an objectively good reason. Here's another kind of reason that is objectively good, is just those that are uncontroversial. So there are many things that in the past were very controversial, and now nobody even questions them or thinks about them. So at one time, doctors, for instance, didn't know if blood circulated through the body, and there were actually controversies, medical controversies, about whether or not blood circulates through the body. Well, now we know that to be true. That's something that's uncontroversial. No one even disputes or talks about it anymore. And that's something, if you had as a premise in your argument, blood circulates through the body, that would be well within your rights to just assert that. Or here's another one. During the Middle Ages, people believed that kings ruled by divine right. And what that means is basically that a king ruled a land, and he thought that his rule over his people was ordained by God. And the people, his subjects, generally accepted that. And this is something that was a very controversial issue back in the 1600s, and people argued both for and against. Well, nowadays, nobody accepts that kings rule by divine right. That's something that's just in the past and is a long dead issue. So you wouldn't need to reestablish that kings don't rule by divine right. If you wanted to use that as a premise in your argument, and you just said kings do not rule by divine right, you'd be perfectly well within your rights to say just that. Finally, reasons that are assumed just for the sake of argument. Like sometimes you make arguments with people and you might say, well, look, let's just assume what you're saying is right. Given what you're saying, then this follows. Sometimes you have to just assume things, you're like, look, just for the sake of argument, work with me here. Or just for the sake of argument, I'm going to agree with you. And that's a perfectly good thing to do when you're making arguments. So here are some examples of objectively good reasons. And again, the reason I'm saying all this is just to respond to this worry that I so often hear that basically whether or not an argument is good or bad is entirely relative, because that's not true. And again, I don't think anybody actually thinks that way or acts that way in real life. We recognize that some things are objectively bad, and they would be bad for pretty much anybody. Alternatively, some reasons are objectively good, and they would be good for anybody. Now, having said all of that, I don't want to dismiss this idea that there is some kind of relativity when it comes to reasons. And whenever you construct an argument, whenever you make an argument, you're always directing that argument to a particular audience. Now, when I say audience here, I don't necessarily have in mind, a large crowd like what you see over here. Your audience is just whoever you're directing your argument to. So if you're, talking to your cousin and you're trying to convince them that, I don't know, the Pittsburgh Pirates are the best team in baseball, or you're trying to convince them that baseball is better than basketball, or then your cousin, since that's the person you're directing your argument to, would be your audience. And the reality is even though there are some standards that apply across the board and for everybody, we also have to acknowledge that some arguments and how convincing they are depend on who you're talking to. So I want to give you an example of an argument right here. So suppose someone tried to argue and tell you that sex before marriage is something that's bad, that you shouldn't have sex before marriage. And you say, well, why shouldn't I? And they said, well, because the Bible forbids it. Now, is that a good argument or is that a bad argument? Well, it all depends. Who are you talking to? If you're talking to an atheist, then no, that would be a terrible argument. Why? Because they don't accept the Bible as an authority. However, if you were talking to someone who is a devout Christian, then yeah, that might be a very good argument. Why? Because they do accept the Bible as an authority. And so I'm mentioning this point because I didn't want to give the impression from what I was saying in the previous couple slides that there is no relativity to the strength of reasons, because there really is. There are some standards that apply across the board. They apply for everybody. At the same time, we can acknowledge that whether or not a reason is good or bad depends sometimes on who you're arguing with. And I say that because premises in your argument, they don't always have to necessarily be true. As long as your opponent is willing to accept them, you can still construct a good argument. And this is kind of goes back to some of the things I was saying a second ago, is that if something is well accepted, it's an objectively good reason. Likewise, truthfully, if something is accepted by the person that you're arguing with, if they're willing to accept a particular premise and you can use that against them, then that would be a fine premise to have within your argument. So those are some general points I want to make about judging reasons and dealing with this concern that whether or not a reason is good or bad is entirely relative to the person you're talking to. While there is some truth to that, that we do have to consider our audience, there are also standards that do apply for everyone and across the board. Going to be looking at throughout the semester, and a very important term that you need to learn is the word fallacy. And what a fallacy is just any general mistake in reasoning. And there are a bunch of different fallacies. There are all kinds, and I'm not going to ask you to memorize any by name. I'll just point them out as we roll along throughout the semester. But the reality is there are a host of different kinds of fallacies. And I think typically people are fairly adept at spotting these, but sometimes lack the vocabulary to adequately discuss these. And I just want to give you a few examples of some common fallacies that do appear. So look at this right here. Here's an argument. Nobody is perfect. I am nobody, therefore I am perfect. Now, do you think that's a good argument? Chances are you don't. This is kind of a silly argument. But what exactly is the problem here? Now, you might say, well, look, you're not nobody. Everybody is somebody. That's true, depending on how you read this. You might say the fallacy that's being committed here is that this premise is false. But there is a way to understand this sentence right here that turns out to be true. If I just said something like, I'm nobody, meaning I'm not anyone who's particularly special, right? And that seems a way that you could understand it that's true. Because in reality, I'm not anyone who's particularly special. I'm not, a world-renowned doctor. I'm not the president. I'm not anyone in particular who's special. I'm ordinary. I'm a nobody, so to speak. But even if you can understand that in a way in which the second sentence is true, it still seems like this argument right here is just silly. There's something, what we might say, fallacious about it. There's a fallacy being committed. And what the fallacy is, I'll just go ahead and tell you, is that the meaning of the word nobody changes from the first sentence to the second sentence. And the first sentence, when they say nobody is perfect, what nobody here means is there does not exist a person who is perfect. Whereas in the second sentence, they're saying, I am not special. Now, when you break it down like that, you say, there does not exist a person who is perfect. I am not special, therefore I am perfect. The argument makes no sense. And this is something that's known as the fallacy of equivocation. Like I said, I'm not going to ask you to remember this particular name, but this is a very common fallacy that people will make where they subtly change the meaning of the word from one sentence to the next. There's another example of this, and I didn't want to give it to you because it's too obvious, but a classic example of this is the following. All rivers have two banks. A bank is a money lending institution. Therefore, all rivers have two money lending institutions. And you can see in that example the meaning of the word bank changes from the first sentence to the second. This is what is known as the fallacy of equivocation. Well, here's another example of a very common fallacy. The Washington Nationals acquired Cy Young winning pitcher Max Scherzer this offseason. With him and some other big acquisition hires, they'll have an all-star player at every single position. The Nationals are going to be awesome this year. Now, some of you might be thinking that this is a good argument. Certainly, if you watch ESPN, you'll see that they reason this way all the time. They'll say things like, well, they have great players at every position, so this team is just going to be incredible. But the reality is this is a fallacy. This is a mistake in reasoning. This is a very common mistake in reasoning. And some of you might already know what the mistake is, or you might have a sense of what it is. Some of you might be saying things to yourself like, well, we know that sometimes you can bring a lot of good players together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they gel as a team. More particular and more specifically, what we can do is we can highlight what the fallacy is. And the fallacy is just this. It assumes because all of the parts are good, that the whole itself will be good. This is a very common fallacy that is known as the fallacy of composition. Composition, because you're putting things together, you're composing something. So think about it like this. Here you can see, I'll give you another example so you can see what the mistake is. You might say something like this. Orange juice is good. Onions are good. Chocolate ice cream is good. So if you put them all together, you'll have something that is delicious. But that's clearly false. Just because the parts all taste good doesn't mean the whole itself will taste good. And this is another example of a very common type of fallacy.